Pre-AD 70. Christianity was not the global, institutional religion later called Christianity. It was a small, Israel-centered first-century covenantal movement living in the shadow of Jerusalem's coming judgment. Its world was the world of law, temple, covenant, priesthood, sacrifice, exile, diaspora, restoration, and the imminent end of the Old Covenant age. Its members were Jews, proselytes, Samaritans, God-fearers, and diaspora Israelites scattered among the nations who were being gathered into Christ before the end of that age. This movement did not understand itself as the beginning of a new Gentile world religion. It understood itself as the faithful remnant of Israel standing at the end of Israel's covenantal age. The gospel concerned those who had been under the law, those who belonged to the covenants, those awaiting the promises, and those being gathered from dispersion into Christ. Paul says of his kinsmen according to the flesh that theirs were the adoption as sons, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the temple service, and the promises per Romans 9:3-4. He says the deliverer would come from Zion and remove ungodliness from Jacob, because this is my covenant with them, per Romans 11:26-27. Hebrews identifies the new covenant as being made with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, per Hebrews 8:8. These are not generic world religion categories. They are Israel's covenant categories. Even mainstream scholarship recognizes that the earliest Jesus movement must be placed inside Judaism, not outside it. Paula Fredrickson frames the earliest movement as a Jewish messianic and an eschatological phenomenon, not as an already formed Gentile religion. Fredrickson summarizes in the situation in her work titled When Christians Were Jews, placing the early Jesus movement firmly within Judaism and describing it as radically eschatological. Source: Paula Fredrickson, When Christians Were Jews, The First Generation, Yale University Press, 2018. That admission matters. The original Jesus movement was not an abstract, universal religion. It was a Jewish, covenantal, eschatological movement expecting the imminent resolution of Israel's story. The mistake of later church history is assuming continuity where the evidence shows rupture. The Christianity of the New Testament generation was aimed at the end of Israel's covenant age. The Christianity that later emerged from the 2nd century onward increasingly became a Gentile reinterpretation of Israel's completed redemptive story. The key is to distinguish between AD 70 as the covenantal break and AD 135 as the historical severing of the Jerusalem church from its Jewish leadership. AD 70 was the covenantal break. That was when Jerusalem and the temple order were judged, the Old Covenant age was brought to its historical end, and the faithful remnant was vindicated. But AD 70 did not mean every Jewish follower of Jesus instantly vanished from history. The surviving remnant continued to live, teach, age, and die. This is where the Jewish bishops of Jerusalem become extremely important. According to Eusebius, the Jerusalem church remained under Hebrew leadership until the time of Hadrian and the Bar Kokhba crisis. Eusebius writes that the first bishops of Jerusalem were of Hebrew descent, and he adds that their whole church consisted then of believing Hebrews. He further says these bishops were all of them belonging to the circumcision. That is a crucial historical admission. The mother church of the Jesus movement did not become Gentile-led immediately after AD 70. It remained visibly Jewish for several more decades. The first 15 bishops of Jerusalem, from James to Judas, were remembered as Jewish or Hebrew leaders. A summary of the tradition states that the first 15 bishops were of Jewish origin, and that after Hadrian suppressed the Bar Kokhba revolt, the bishops became Gentiles. Source: Early Bishops of Jerusalem, an historical summary drawing from Eusebius' episcopal lists. This means the post-AD 70 period must be understood as a transitional period. The covenantal mission had reached its endpoint in AD 70, but the human survivors of that fulfilled mission remained. The Jewish Jesus movement did not instantly become Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, or Protestantism. It lingered as a remnant. It survived locally and visibly in Jerusalem until the Hadrianic rupture. That rupture came with the Bar Kokhba revolt and the refounding of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. After the revolt, Jewish access to Jerusalem was restricted or forbidden, and the old Jewish Jerusalem was replaced by a Roman colonial city. One historical summary says, after the Bar Kokhba War, the Romans forbade the Jews access to Jerusalem, and adds that the line of Jewish bishops stopped in the year 135. A Gentile bishop, Mark, was then appointed. Source: Sarah Jane Boss, Suzanne Olson, Mary McNamara, The First 100 Years of Christianity in Jerusalem, Bible and Interpretation. Eusebius also preserves this transition. After the Jewish bishops, Marcus became the first Gentile bishop of Jerusalem. Later, ecclesiastical summaries likewise list Mark or Marcus as the first Gentile bishop after Hadrian's siege. Source: Catholic Encyclopedia, Jerusalem AD 71 to 1099, citing the post-Hadrianic episcopal succession. So, the better historical model is this. AD 30 to 70, the apostolic, Israel-centered, covenantal Jesus movement awaiting the end of the Old Covenant age. AD 70 to 135, the surviving Jewish Jesus movement continues. Historically, especially in Jerusalem, under bishops of the circumcision, AD 135 onward, the Jerusalem church is severed from its Jewish leadership. Jerusalem becomes Aelia Capitolina. Jews are excluded or restricted, and Gentile leadership takes over. The Jewish bishops show that the original movement was not Gentile Roman Greek or institutionally Catholic. It was Israelite to its core. The fact that Jerusalem itself remained under Jewish Christian leadership until AD 135 confirms that the original Jesus movement belonged to Israel's covenant world, not to the later Gentile theological system that claimed to be its continuation. The AD 135 transition also explains how the later church could claim continuity, while actually representing rupture. Once Jerusalem's Jewish leadership was gone, Greek and Latin-cultured post-apostolic interpreters increasingly controlled the story. They inherited Israel's texts, but not Israel's covenantal context. They read the scriptures as a new Gentile religious inheritance rather than as the completed redemptive drama of Israel. Christianity did not simply descend in a neat, uninterrupted line from the apostolic movement. Identity boundaries were constructed. Christianity and Judaism became increasingly separate through later conflict, heresiology, imperial politics, and Gentile institutional development. The first-century Jesus movement was still inside Israel's covenantal world. The later Gentile church increasingly defined itself over against that world. The New Testament does not present a Gentile world religion detached from Israel. It presents Israel's covenant crisis. It presents the remnant, the diaspora, the God-fearers, the proselytes, the Samaritans, and those attached to Israel's synagogue world being gathered before the end. Paul's mission pattern reflects this. He goes to synagogues. He addresses Jews and God-fearers. He argues from Israel's scriptures. He defines sin through the law. He places resurrection, judgment, inheritance, and reconciliation inside Israel's covenantal framework. One of the most important shifts in this post-AD 70 reinterpretation was the expansion of the word Gentiles. In the New Testament setting, the Gentiles receiving the gospel were not random, unrelated pagans in the abstract. They were people already connected to Israel's covenant world, diaspora Israelites scattered among the nations, Samaritans, proselytes, God-fearers, and synagogue-attached Gentiles who worshipped Israel's God and heard Moses read every Sabbath. Paul's mission pattern confirms this. He went first to synagogues, addressed Jews and God-fearers, reasoned from Israel's scriptures, and announced the fulfillment of Israel's promises. But later, Gentile Christianity flattened that context and turned Gentiles into a universal category, meaning all non-Jews everywhere. That semantic shift allowed post-AD 70 Christianity to claim that the gospel was always intended for the entire pagan world, when the New Testament itself places Gentile inclusion inside Israel's covenantal restoration. This is why 1 Corinthians 7 is so important. Paul tells the circumcised not to become uncircumcised, and the uncircumcised not to seek circumcision, because the time had been shortened, and the form of this world was passing away, per 1 Corinthians 7:18-31. That world was not planet Earth. It was the covenantal order of Israel's Temple-age world, the very order that collapsed in AD 70. John's revelation belongs to that same covenantal crisis. Revelation presents the faithful covenant remnant as the victors, those redeemed, restored, and vindicated through Christ. It presents the unbelieving Old Covenant order, centered in Jerusalem and its temple system, as the object of judgment. Revelation was not predicting the rise of a future Gentile religion. It was dramatizing the end of Israel's Old Covenant world and the vindication of the faithful remnant before that world disappeared. But after AD 70, and especially after AD 135, a different movement increasingly emerged. Greek and Latin-cultured interpreters, largely removed from the original Israelite covenantal setting, began reusing Israel's redemptive narrative for themselves. They took the scriptures, promises, symbols, and covenant categories that belonged to Israel's story and reapplied them to their own post-AD 70 communities. They universalized what had been covenantal. They spiritualized what had been historically specific. They turned Israel's fulfilled redemptive drama into the foundation for a new, ongoing, Gentile religious institution. Justin Martyr is one of the clearest examples. In dialogue with Trypho, Justin explicitly claims Israel's identity for Christians. He writes, "For the true spiritual Israel are we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ." Source: Justin Martyr, Dialogue with Trypho, Chapter 11, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1, editors Alexander Roberts and James Donaldson, translators Marcus Dodds and George Reith. Christian Literature Publishing, 1885. That is not merely interpretation. That is identity transfer. Justin is not simply saying Gentiles may worship Israel's God. He is claiming that Christians are the true spiritual Israel. In later chapters of the same work, Justin continues pressing the argument that Christians properly understand the meaning of Israel and Israel's scriptures, while unbelieving Jews do not. Source: Justin Martyr, Dialogue with Trypho, chapters 125 to 142, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1. Tertullian continues this pattern. In an answer to the Jews, he argues from Rebekah's two sons that the older people, the Jews, must serve the younger people, the Christians. He writes that the prior and greater people, that is, the Jewish, must necessarily serve the less, and that the less people, that is, the Christian, overcome the greater. Source: Tertullian, An Answer to the Jews, Chapter 1, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 3, editors Alexander Roberts, James Donaldson, and a Cleveland Cox, translator S. Thelwall, Christian Literature Publishing Company, 1885. That is classic replacement logic. The Jewish people are cast as the older, rejected people. The Christian people are cast as the younger, victorious people. This is not the New Testament's covenantal restoration of Israel. It is a later Gentile theological transfer of Israel's status to the Church. Origen also develops a spiritualized replacement framework. In De Principiis, He speaks of an Israel according to the Spirit and says that if one adopts the idea of a Jew inwardly, then, as there is a bodily race of Jews, so also is there a race of Jews inwardly. Source: Origin, De Principiis, on First Principles, Book 4, in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 4. Frederick Crombie, Christian Literature Publishing Company, 1885. Origen's move is crucial. Israel is no longer primarily the covenant people whose story reached its promised first-century climax. Israel becomes a spiritual category that later Gentile Christians can claim for themselves. That is exactly how Israel's concrete covenantal identity gets dissolved into later church theology. Marcion represents an even more radical rupture. He rejected the Old Testament and distinguished the God of the Hebrew Scriptures from the God revealed by Jesus. A modern discussion of Marcion summarizes his teaching as the claim that the God of the Old Testament was distinct from the loving God of the New. Source: Marx v. Brettler, guest post on Bart D. Ehrman's Ehrman blog, discussing Marcion and Christian stereotypes of the God of the Old Testament. Marcion was condemned by the emerging Catholic Church, but the broader Church retained a softer form of the same basic error. It kept Israel's scriptures while transferring their covenant identity to itself. Marcion rejected Israel's scriptures outright. Justin, Tertullian, and Origen kept them, but claimed that Jews did not properly understand them and that Christians were now the true inheritors of Israel's place. The difference is important, but both paths represent rupture from the original covenantal frame. One path rejects Israel's scriptures, the other path appropriates them. This is why the post-AD 70 and post-135 church fathers were not simply preserving apostolic Christianity, they were building a new interpretive system after the covenantal story had already reached its conclusion. They did not understand Jesus' mission as the restoration of Israel before the end of the Old Covenant age. They did not understand the parousia as Christ's covenantal coming in judgment upon Israel. They did not understand resurrection, salvation, reconciliation, and judgment as covenantal categories tied to Israel under the law. Instead, they created a future-oriented, Gentile, institutionalized version of Christianity. The canonical Gospels also have to be handled carefully in this discussion. They should not simply be called forgeries, because that is too easy to dismiss. A stronger claim is that the Gospels are formally anonymous writings later attached to apostolic names. Bart Ehrman states the issue plainly. The Gospels themselves are completely anonymous. None of the authors identifies himself by name. Source: Bart D. Ehrman, Our Anonymous Gospels, starting with Luke, the Bart Ehrman blog, September 10, 2025. See also Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels, 2016, page 90. That does not by itself prove the Gospels are fraudulent, but it does show that the later Church's confidence about apostolic authorship rests on post-compositional attribution and ecclesiastical tradition, not on self-identification inside the texts themselves. In the context of this essay, that matters because the later Gentile Church increasingly controlled not only the interpretation of Israel's scriptures, but also the framing of Jesus' story. The Jewish bishops of Jerusalem until AD 135 make this even clearer. If the Mother Church remained Jewish-led until the Hadrianic crisis, then the later Gentile Church was not simply what Christianity always was. It was what Christianity became after the historical removal of the Jewish Jerusalem center. The original movement was Israelite. The later movement was increasingly Gentile. The original movement awaited the end of Israel's age. The later movement invented another future end. The original movement concerned Israel's covenant promises. The later movement claimed those promises for itself. This is the great mistake of mainstream church history. Scholars often assume that the Christianity that began in the 1st century continued in a straight, uninterrupted line into the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. They treat post-AD 70 and post-AD 135 Christianity as the natural continuation of the apostolic movement. But that assumption hides the rupture. The New Testament movement was about the end of Israel's covenant age. The later church was about extending Israel's completed story into a new Gentile religious future. Modern scholarship recognizes many pieces of this puzzle. Scholars acknowledge that Christianity began as a Jewish apocalyptic movement. They acknowledge that AD 70 was a massive interpretive event. They acknowledge that the period from AD 70 to AD 135 was decisive for the separation of Jews and Christians. They acknowledge that the Church Fathers increasingly defined Christians over against Jews. They acknowledge that the Gospels are anonymous writings later attached to apostolic names. But they rarely connect these observations into the more radical conclusion: post-AD 135 Gentile Christianity was not the simple continuation of apostolic Christianity. It was a theological replacement of it. Genuine Christians were first-century Jews, proselytes, Samaritans, God-fearers, and diaspora Israelites gathered into Christ before the end of the Old Covenant age. They were the remnant of Israel, the scattered sheep, the covenant people being restored before judgment fell. Some were circumcised Jews, others were uncircumcised Israelites, proselytes, or synagogue-attached Gentiles counted within Israel's covenantal world. This is why Paul could tell them to remain in the condition in which they were called. The end was near, the age was passing away. The covenantal distinction between circumcision and uncircumcision was being rendered irrelevant because the Old Covenant order itself was about to disappear. There were no unrelated, non-Israelite Christians in the New Testament sense. There were covenantally connected people being gathered into Israel's promised restoration. That included Jews, diaspora Israelites, Samaritans, proselytes, and God-fearers attached to Israel's scriptures, synagogues, and covenant hope. But it did not include random, unrelated pagans being absorbed into a new universal religion, disconnected from Israel's covenant story. What people call Christianity today is therefore not the continuation of the New Testament movement. It is the continuation of the post-AD 70 and post-AD 135 reinterpretation of that movement. Modern Christians may be sincere, but sincerity does not create covenant identity. They have inherited a religious system that told them Israel's story was about them, Israel's promises belonged to them, Israel's scriptures were written to them, and Israel's Messiah came for them. But the New Testament itself places the entire redemptive drama inside Israel's covenant world. The Jewish bishops of Jerusalem are the bridge that proves the point. They show that the original Jesus movement remained Jewish in its Jerusalem center after AD 70. They also show that the decisive historical severing occurred after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Jewish leadership disappeared from Jerusalem and Gentile leadership took over. AD 70 ended the covenantal age. AD 135 marked the visible historical displacement of the Jewish Jerusalem church. That distinction makes the argument stronger. AD 70 was the end of the covenantal story. AD 135 was the end of the Jewish Jerusalem church's visible leadership. After that, Gentile Christianity increasingly became the institutional heir of a story that had already been fulfilled. Primitive Christianity did not become Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, or Protestantism. Primitive Christianity reached its covenantal goal in the 1st century. Its surviving Jewish remnant lingered into the early 2nd century, especially in Jerusalem. But after AD 135, the visible center was severed from its Jewish leadership. What came afterward was not the same faith continuing through history. It was a post-AD 135 Gentile religious appropriation of Israel's fulfilled redemptive narrative. In short, genuine Christianity belonged to the first-century covenant people of Israel and those covenantally joined to them. It was about the restoration of Israel, the fulfillment of Israel's promises, the judgment of Israel's old covenant world, and the end of Israel's age. The Jewish bishops of Jerusalem until AD 135 confirm that original Israelite character. But after the Hadrianic rupture, the Jerusalem church became Gentile-led, and the broader post-apostolic church increasingly reinterpreted Israel's story as its own. That was not continuity, it was replacement. Why the Israel-only paradigm was missed for nearly 2,000 years. The apostolic layer, 40s to 60s CE, in Paul's genuine letters, he framed everything in Israel's covenant story per Romans 9, 4-5, and Galatians 4, 4-5. His Gentiles were God-fearers, proselytes, and diaspora Israelites, not random pagans from across the globe. However, by broadening the category of seed of Abraham to include the faithful from Israel who were not native to the covenant, Paul's letters could later be read in more universal terms. This redefinition of Israel was the seed of later universalization. The late 1st century, 70s to 90s CE, after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the original covenantal framework, centered on Israel's land, law, and temple, collapsed. Communities that survived needed to reinterpret their identity. The Gospels, especially Matthew, Luke, John, penned many years after AD 70, use terms that are open to inviting a wider, symbolic audience. Matthew used the term nations in the Great Commission per Matthew 2:8-19. Originally, it was meant to refer to Israelites among the nations. Later, it was interpreted more widely as Paul turning to all nation-states. The 2nd century, 100 CE, the generation after the apostles, saw Gentile believers outnumber Jewish believers. By necessity, the message had to adapt, or else wither. Writers like Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr began teaching that the church was the new Israel, inheriting Israel's promises. Justin Martyr, 150 CE, explicitly argues that the scriptures belong to Christians, not Jews, and that Christ fulfilled Israel's covenant for all mankind. This was a watershed moment, and the revelation, while rooted in Israel's story, was already being read from a cosmic perspective rather than a covenantal perspective. The 3rd and 4th centuries, 200s to 300 CE, Origen and later Augustine advanced a universalist hermeneutic. Equivalent allegory of the Church. When Constantine legalized Christianity, 313 CE, and it became the empire's religion, universality became political necessity. A faith limited to ancient Israel would never serve as a unifying imperial ideology. The Church needed the Bible to speak to everyone. The result, what began as covenantal promises to Israel, were recast as timeless promises to the Church, and then to all humanity. By the time of the ecumenical councils, 4th to 5th centuries, the audience relevance question was buried under layers of tradition, allegory, and institutional necessity. Christianity as a universal religion had fully eclipsed the covenantal story of Israel. Why did the universalization of New Testament texts persist? Doctrinal commitments. If scholars admit the texts were written to and for a specific first-century audience, it undercuts the idea that the Bible directly applies to everyone today. That creates too much tension with church traditions and theological systems that depend on universalizing the text. Institutional pressures. Many scholars are employed by seminaries, universities, or denominational contexts, where audience-exclusive interpretations would be career-ending. It's safer to focus on philology, history, or themes without shaking the foundation of modern Christianity with a consistent application of audience relevance. Hermeneutical habits. Christianity has been reading the Bible as though it's written to them for nearly 2 millennia. Scholars themselves are often shaped by that framework. So even when they note historical context, they rarely let it redefine the boundaries of application. Fear of implications. If Paul's letters and the Gospels were truly only directed to first-century Israel and her covenant world, then most of Christian theology, soteriology, eschatology, ethics, loses its universal authority. That conclusion is so disruptive that many avoid the question altogether. Universities and seminaries, even today, grow out of those church traditions. The training is built on frameworks like covenant theology, dispensationalism, or historical critical liberalism. All assume universality by default. Confirmation bias. Scholars read Paul, Jesus, or Revelation with presuppositions inherited from their mentors. They look for ways to reinforce Christianity as universal instead of questioning it. For example, when Paul says, "We who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord," per 1 Thessalonians 4:15, most commentaries assume Paul didn't really mean that generation. Instead, they reinterpret it to fit the inherited paradigm of a future global return of Christ. When Paul mentions Gentiles, it is just assumed to mean all non-Jewish people everywhere. When they see the word world, it's assumed to refer to the entire planet. In reality, the Gentiles Paul was seeking were people already within Israel's covenantal structure, God-fearers, proselytes and diaspora Israelites. The world wasn't the entire planet. It was the covenant world of Israel, the temple, and diaspora synagogue communities. Career and gatekeeping. A scholar who says bluntly, "This letter only applied to Israelites in the 1st century, and its promises aren't for us," risks their career. Publications, tenure, and teaching posts often depend on aligning with mainstream or denominationally safe conclusions. So, even brilliant scholars will hedge. They'll admit audience relevance in the introduction, but then pivot back to a universal application in the conclusion. The weight of tradition. The Church has had nearly 2,000 years to build elaborate theologies, liturgies, and identities on the assumption that the Bible speaks directly to everyone. That weight makes it unthinkable for most scholars to strip away universality, even when the text points that way. This creates an echo chamber. Each generation of scholars quotes the last, reinforcing inherited frameworks rather than re-examining them from the ground up. Today's Christianity, including the academic institutions that have enabled it for centuries, is that echo chamber.